Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. I think we may have a couple more people coming in, but they can join us as we go. Let's get underway. We've got a lot to talk about today. So delighted to have everyone here, particularly our special guest today. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar called The Changing Face of Indigenous Education. My name is Betty Rice, and I work in communications and administration at Community Campus Engage Canada, or CCE Canada. You will see coming up in the chat a link to our website so that you can learn more about CCE Canada if you wish. I'm honored to be speaking to you today from my home office in Calgary, a land that our guest speaker is quite familiar with. I do want to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 of Southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And if anybody else would like to acknowledge the land they're on, please do so in the chat box. We'd like to see that. Today, we are very excited to have with us Dr. Jacqueline Ottmann, who's the president of First Nations University of Canada, based in Regina, who I will introduce more formally in a moment. First, I'd just like to give the audience an outline of the structure of today's webinar. I will introduce Dr. Ottmann, and she and I will have a conversation about some of the activity in Indigenous post-secondary education today. There are really some exciting new initiatives taking place, and there are partnerships and groups being formed to advance this important work. We'll also talk about some of the challenges we need to continue to address. And then we'll go to questions from you, the audience. Please feel free to submit your questions in the chat as we go along, or raise your hand when we get to the Q&A portion of the program. That's pretty much it as far as the housekeeping duties. So let's get going. I am absolutely delighted to introduce our guest today. Dr. Jacqueline Ottmann is Anishinaabe Saulteaux from Fishing Lake First Nation in Saskatchewan. Prior to her academic career, Jackie was an elementary and high school teacher and a principal. She remains an engaged scholar alongside her responsibilities as a senior academic leader. While at the University of Calgary, she was the coordinator of the First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and Inuit undergraduate teacher exchange program within the Workland School of Education. She also co-chaired the Workland's Indigenous strategy, and alongside the provost, the university-wide Indigenous strategy. She was really instrumental in developing that strategy for the University of Calgary. Full disclosure here, Jackie and I met and worked together while she was at the Workland School of Education. After a time at the University of Saskatchewan as professor and vice provost, Indigenous engagement, she was appointed president of the First Nations University of Canada. She has been recognized as an international researcher, an advocate, and change maker whose purpose is to transform practices inclusive of Indigenous leadership, methodologies, and pedagogies. Jackie is driven to create schools and communities that foster a deeper sense of belonging and appreciation for Indigenous people, their histories, stories, ways of knowing and being. Jackie's also the first Indigenous person to become president of the Canadian Society for the Study of Education. So with that, I'd like to say, hi, Jackie, how are you?
Hello, Betty. I'm doing very good. As I was sharing earlier, I love summer. I love gardening, the sun, and all the long walks that I could take during this time of the year.
I don't know how you can find a lot of time to take long walks. You're pretty busy at First Nations University. There's so much going on. I'm not even really sure of where to start. Every time I go to do a little bit of research and say, okay, so what's happening new? What's new at First Nations University? There's something else that's just come up. And so I don't know, maybe can you give us like the last 6 months, some of the larger initiatives that have happened that you want to talk about?
I can, and I began in this position on September of last year. So it's just been over 6 months and getting closer to the 1 year mark. And yes, a lot has happened within this short while. And I think some of it has to do with the increasing awareness of Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, and the desire to learn more from Indigenous peoples, and to learn from the various diverse perspectives that are across the country. And so one of the things that happened early on in my tenure was the challenge of fraudulent claims to Indigenous identity. And so basically what happened in the fall was I started receiving phone calls from Indigenous scholars and leaders from across the country about a forum that would be focused on Indigenous identity. So a dialogue for Indigenous peoples that are connected to post-secondary institutions. And so the message that I was getting was that First Nations University of Canada would be the likely place for such a forum, primarily because we were seen as a safe place, and we don't have the complexities, many complexities that I'll say mainstream universities have. And so our foundation are Indigenous knowledge systems. And so we don't have to advocate for a voice or space within First Nations University of Canada for Indigenous peoples. And so that was significant for our community. And I went to our elders, so they're a part of our governance structure, and my executive, and made the decision to say yes to that request, or to those requests, and then began months of planning. And we did reach out to Senator and Chancellor Maurice Sinclair, and so those were very, very informative and supportive conversations that we had. And that was done at the beginning of March of this year. So we had just under 400 Indigenous leaders, faculty, scholars, students, elders, community members that are connected to post-secondary institutions attend that forum, and it was an Indigenous only space. So that was held over 2 days, and it was amazing. It was emotional and powerful. And there is a report that is on our website that's available to anyone and everyone based on that particular forum. And so it was that was a big event for us. And so a second one will be held at the end of October, again, an Indigenous only space for now, and with the intent that the third forum will be open. And the sentiment was that in the first forum, the dialogue, it seemed to many people that the dialogue was just beginning. So we'll be planning. We're in the stages of planning for the second forum. So there's that bit, and we are also. I should say before I move on to others that those videos, because we had panelists again from across the country. Legal panel, a faculty, Indigenous faculty panel, those are all available on our website. So for people to listen to. And shortly after that, we held an Indigenous health and wellness forum again in March, and that was available for everyone and across the country or internationally. And just with the purpose of supporting the Indigenous community, or our Indigenous students, through this challenging time. And the pandemic has been difficult for all of us. And so the disparities have been exacerbated in many places, in many areas. And we know that supporting mental health was something that we had to do. So we held another 2-day forum, and all those sessions are available online. But we brought in some prominent people like James Makokis and his partner Anthony Johnston and Willie Ermine. So Indigenous perspectives on health and wellness. I learned so much from those 2 days myself, and so we're going to be hosting series of these, and all of this material, this learning material, will be available online. So we feel it's important to share. So those are two, and then another thing is that there was the launch of the Indigenous Continuing Education Center. And within
that just happened, did it not?
It happened 6 months ago, and in a few short months, that center is pretty well sustainable, self-sustainable, and so one of the programs that is part of our ICEC is 4 Seasons of Reconciliation, and we have, and this is conservative, I believe. Over 100,000 Canadians have taken that program to date. So, and it is going to be available for free for Canadians over the summer again. And from that particular program are other programs that will deepen the learning for Canadians, and so there's that, and there's Indigenous leadership. We're going to be looking at a paralegal program that will be a part of our ICEC. So that's a dynamic center for us. Our research center is growing and strengthening. We're a tri-council, and so we're in the process of creating our own Indigenous Ethics Committee, and talking about how we could be of service to other organizations in this area. Of course, there's the National Center for Collaboration, and that's on our website. And there are videos and stories and materials, learning materials that people can use in various ways. And we have not too long ago, the National Indigenous Economic Strategy was released. I believe that was on June 6th. And under 4 categories, there are 107 Indigenous calls to Indigenous prosperity, economic prosperity. And First Nations University of Canada was identified as the institution that will house all of the work that is related to these calls to action. And so we're very excited about that. And oh gosh, like we have programs in northern Alberta, northern Ontario, southern Ontario, in BC. So our reach is growing, and that's definitely a part of our mandate. And we have an Indigenous birthing program that is in development, and Maria Campbell will be helping to develop that, or is helping to develop that. One thing we've learned is that through colonial practices, we have our birthing ceremonies, Indigenous birthing ceremonies, have suffered. We still have our funeral ceremonies, but our birthing ceremonies have, for of course obvious reasons, been challenged. And so through Indigenous birthing program, which will hopefully evolve into midwifery program, these birthing ceremonies will research, and they'll become strong again in our communities. And
we talked a little bit about that, and I think it sounded so exciting to bring back the birthing program. And as you were describing it, it was sort of finding that combination between the importance of the cultural aspects of the birthing program, combined with Western practice in terms of medical aspects of it. So are you seeing more and more of those opportunities to combine the traditional cultural practices with the Western educational I'm not quite sure of how to word that, the Western part of those programs?
That is something that First Nations University has done for many years. Our foundation, as I mentioned earlier, are Indigenous knowledge systems, and so our organizational structure and every bit of the university is framed and organized with that in mind, with those in mind, and also we weave both these Indigenous knowledges alongside Western perspectives. Mm-hmm. And so students that graduate from First Nations University of Canada will get the benefit of both. And so if it is the discipline related to sciences, there will be a strong element of Indigenous perspectives on sciences. And so that is, I think, something you can call a two-eyed seeing approach. Our strength are the Indigenous perspectives, and our elders are just amazing in these knowledges, and there's so much that the general public can learn from these perspectives, especially in our current time where sustainability and stewardship are just so important.
Yeah. Well, for those who don't know a lot about First Nations University, and I will say, Magda, thank you so much. Magda's putting up links to all of the things you're talking about in the chat, so folks take over there and you'll see them. How long has First Nations University been around? I don't know that a lot of people know the basic history of First Nations University.
Yeah, so First Nations University began as Saskatchewan Indian Federated College, and it began in 1976. And so the offices originally were within the University of Saskatchewan, and not a part of the University of Saskatchewan, but when there was this opportunity to grow, the University of Regina was very eager to be a part of that partnership and collaboration. And so since 1976, there has been this integrated approach, I'll say this, of Indigenous knowledges and Western knowledges, right? And so we've been around for some time. And the name change happened in early 2000. And so we've had an amazing history, and we do have 4 campuses. So we've got our main campus at the university, or in Regina, and that's a beautiful Douglas Cardinal building, which took years to fundraise. And then we have our Saskatoon campus and a Prince Albert campus, and we have a traditional campus. So in each location is bursting at the seams. And so we've just acquired more space here in Saskatoon. I'm in Saskatoon today. And we're looking to build a new campus in our Prince Albert location.
I'm guessing that that bursting at the seams is probably a good problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It really is. Yes, of course, with all this new programming, we need to have the people's support, the people expertise, and so that's it's an exciting place to be.
Well, as if you're not doing enough at First Nations University, you're also involved in a new organization that started up this year. And you said it, and I'm going to get it wrong. It's NUSLA?
NULSA, yeah.
So tell us about that.
The National Indigenous University Senior Leaders Association was formally announced, I believe it was in December or early January. But the gatherings were, we've had the gatherings for some years, and it might have been, I'm just thinking about one of the larger gatherings that we had was at the University of UBC. So at UBC, when CSSC, when Congress, when they hosted Congress, so Indigenous leaders and faculty members stayed another day, and at that point there were over 40 that stayed for the day. And it was, again, just one of those, it felt good to be together and to talk about, to share stories of accomplishments and also challenges, and to really, dive into a solutions oriented dialogue. So, but the formal aspect of it just started to take form probably about a year ago. So it was during the pandemic. And in many cases, the Indigenous senior leader or a senior leader who is Indigenous is working, I don't want to say in isolation, but there are feelings of isolation. So this network is very, very important. It does bring together Indigenous senior leaders from across the country, and we do get to talk about challenges and issues, and again, as I mentioned, solutions oriented dialogue. And to strengthen and build capacities of senior leaders. So it's an important association, and it was also important to finally formalize this particular group. And so NOSA co-hosted the National Dialogue on Indigenous Identity, which is the name of that is going to be changed to Indigenous citizenship. But so we are gathering fairly regularly, and so this association will also provide insight into Indigenous perspectives on principles on education, for instance. And so there is that phrase that we've heard so often these last few years, is nothing without us, about us. And so in some cases, there may have been Indigenous principles that were developed with very little Indigenous participation. And so when you have an association like this, it's I think will not only challenge systems, but will strengthen systems, because there is that, some people don't like the word authentic, but I'll use it here, that authentic voice or voices that will help inform Indigenous education and post-secondary systems. So we are here for Indigenous students, for all students, and so I see it as very important to bring Indigenous people together for the purpose of strengthening the whole.
And I want to jump back to, because you mentioned the National Indigenous Identity Forum, Indigenous citizenship, whatever you're going to end up calling it. But you partnered with them, FNU partnered with the senior leaders on this program. Mm-hmm. I also saw just this last week or so that you've partnered now with the Johnson Shayama Graduate School of Public Policy, which I think is University of Regina and University of Saskatchewan. They have locations in both the two Saskatchewan campuses, to build something which maybe comes out of this kind of a dialogue. It's a nation building program, Indigenous leaders. So can you
Mhm.
talk a little bit about this new program with the folks at U of S and U of R?
Right. So this has been this collaboration has begun probably about 3 years ago, and so it's finally emerged to this place where this program can be offered, and so there is that, again, that collaborative um, effort of creating a program that will benefit our Indigenous leaders. And so this is a graduate program for Indigenous leaders, and they could be community-based leaders. So they could be chiefs in our communities. It could be their council members in our communities, and so the program was created with the feedback of community leaders, and just learning what their needs are and what's important to them in terms of their leadership development. And so it is a demonstration of a desire for lifelong learning, yeah, on the Indigenous leader side. And of course, there's this relationship that we have with Johnson Shoyama, and Johnson Shoyama is also unique in that it's connected to University of Saskatchewan and University of Regina, and so there's offices in both universities, and so we get the benefit of people from each institution to build this particular program, and that's an area of strong interest for me, is Indigenous leadership development, and that was a focus of my graduate level research and some of my writing and publication.
Well, is this something that is an opportunity for people from other parts of the country? I mean, will there be some opportunities for some distance learning,
Right.
or are you concentrating just in your area?
No, this is an opportunity for people across the country. Anything we do is developed with the larger context in mind. So it's not limited to Saskatchewan, and in many cases not limited to Canada. So the programming is available to anyone who has that interest. So as our name indicates, we are First Nations University of Canada, and another misconception is that we are just for First Nations, and we're not. So we have a Indigenous and non-Indigenous student demographic. Interestingly, if we're looking at student demographics, 78% of our student enrollment are female.
Really?
So yes. Mm-hmm.
And what about the non-Indigenous student population? Is that growing?
It's growing, definitely. Yeah, and that has always been the case, and so we've had that non-Indigenous enrollment for years. Yes, and we also offer, because in Regina in particular, we're situated right next door to the University of Regina. So we offer Indigenous studies programs to students from University of Regina. So we have these in addition, we have these articulation agreements, and we're signing MOUs with universities internationally. And the one that's closest right now is with the university in Mongolia. And of course, there's a university in New Zealand that we're in dialogue with, and in the United States. So there's an MOU that has been signed with the university in Argentina, and so we are open to these collaborations and partnerships internationally.
That's so exciting to hear that there are that many people in different parts of the world who are engaging and getting involved. And I want to bring it down to a micro level here. A lot of the people who are part of CCE Canada are involved in community-based organizations in Canada, small and sometimes national. How do you think these community-based organizations can become more engaged in and with the Indigenous communities around them, with First Nations University? What sort of, I mean, other than some of these, I mean, the 4 Seasons of Reconciliation course sounds fantastic, and certainly recommend that everybody have a look at that. But beyond that, what can they do in their day-to-day practice to be more engaged with Indigenous community around them, or bigger than that? What do you think?
And that's an important question. And one of the things that we talked about earlier was allyship, and how is allyship defined? And so there's I'm just going to back it up a bit, and some of the words and concepts that we've been hearing about over the last few years are indigenization and decolonization and reconciliation. And so it's understanding as an organization and as an individual what each of these means to us individually and corporately or organizationally, and what does indigenization mean? And so indigenization, from my perspective, involves and engages Indigenous peoples, because what it does is when you're indigenizing, you're uplifting Indigenous knowledges, traditions, stories. You're centering them, and those stories and teachings can only come from Indigenous peoples, and so there is this importance of not only walking alongside Indigenous peoples, but in many cases, allowing Indigenous peoples to lead the process. I was a committee member of this PhD student, and she's passed beautifully. Her dissertation was amazing. Non-Indigenous student that was writing about an Indigenous topic, and it was interesting to see how her perspective changed throughout the whole program, to where in the very beginning she was more centered in the research. But as time went on, it was the Indigenous voices that became centered. And what she did is she inserted some of her journal entries talking about the shift that was happening inside her. And so one of the questions that a committee member asked in her final defense was, so when's the book coming out? And when are you going to write this book? And she said, it's not for me to write. She wouldn't have been able to complete this amazing project without Indigenous insights, without Indigenous stories. And whereas historically, researchers and people who felt were supporting community were either taking or invading in one way or another. So what she did in her answer was to say that if she wrote a book, she wouldn't be the first author. It would be her participants who would be identified as first authors.
Sure.
And she said that historically, it would be Indigenous peoples who would be tapping non-Indigenous peoples on the shoulder saying, it's time for you to tap out. This is where we have to step in. And she said, in a more eloquent way than I can, that non-Indigenous peoples have to tap themselves out. And that was such a powerful.
And to know when to tap out.
And to know when to tap out, right?
But I love how you've described her shift in thinking.
Mm-hmm.
That as she delved deeper and as she learned more, her thinking shifted. I think that's really incredible. And I think what I heard you say is that allyship kind of equals asking and listening.
Active listening, right? Yeah. And allowing that space. And we know this, sometimes when we see a problem or an issue, first of all, we see it through our particular lived experiences and perspectives, and we interpret it that way. And we start to solve problems from that particular place, when it's so important to ask questions and to allow those answers. You learn silence means something. You learn that there are different forms of resistance, and so it's important to develop relationships, and to see these relationships as reciprocal. And so there is that learning that happens both ways, and that requires humility. Humility by people who are wanting to partner with Indigenous peoples. And so I talked about indigenization, and decolonization is a collective responsibility, because we have all been impacted by colonization. There is that colonial mindset of taking space, of taking over. And so how do we decolonize? We have to do that as a collective. So I see decolonization as a challenging force. I see indigenization as a healing force, because all of our philosophies have to do with relationship. Let's look at, and it's said differently in our languages, but the philosophy of all my relations, that is about interconnectivity. It's about realizing the interdependence that we have on each other in our environment. It's about meaningful relationship. As Chief Seattle said in the 1800s, we are connected like the blood that unites us. We did not weave the web of life. We are merely a strand in it. What we do to the web, we do to ourselves. That encapsulates that philosophy of all my relations. And so the indigenization really does start to look at those kinds, developing those kinds of essential collaborations, partnerships, relationships. And so both of those, decolonization and indigenization, lead to deeper forms of reconciliation. Right. So in my mind, it's a bit of a triad. And of course, truth is very much a part of that. Truth telling, truth hearing, and there's literature on active listening and astute observation. And developing relationships with Indigenous peoples takes a lot of time, because we're so used to short-term relationships. Our teachers come into our schools and spend 2 years and they're gone for other opportunities. Our medical and health professionals come in short term, and many of them, not all of them, but most of them come into our communities and they're gone after 6 months or a year. So that is something that we're used to. So because there's a need to build trust, then there has to be that commitment to time before you actually start learning the truth. I've said in the past that some of the research that has been done on Indigenous peoples is probably suspect, because the relationship and trust hasn't been there. So you have an outsider coming in wanting to mine knowledges and take it away and never come back. So, and our community members know that. So are they going to give you the truth? Are they going to give you the extent of the knowledge that that is being requested? In many cases, no.
And that's why this takes time. It does. And it's so interesting because, of course, now we're all developing Indigenous strategies, statements. But if you don't mean what you say, if you don't truly mean what you say as you make these statements and these pledges to work towards reconciliation, they're empty. And this is a perspective that makes sense from what you just said. It really is. If you're going to draft a statement, make sure that you really can take it and action it and move forward with it. I think that's a really important point. There's so much going on. We certainly are happy to open up to questions. Here's one that just came in. You talked about some of the successes regarding current and emerging events. How have they created these current and emerging events, or how have current and emerging events created challenges in terms of fulfilling your mission, vision, strategic plans, those sorts of things? Are they obstacles? Are they opportunities? What are you seeing?
I see whatever comes our way as an opportunity, and so if there is a challenge, then there's the opportunity to see how we can move through that particular challenge. And it's not going around it, it's not avoiding it. It's moving through that particular challenge, and of course as a community. So I'm not sure if I'm answering that correctly, but and this is where, especially in our time, when there are certain crises in our world, and we've been asked to be awake, or we've been called to be awake. We have this video on our website. Again, it's called Waniska, and it means awaken in Cree, or awake in Cree. It is a beautiful film. And so we have been asked to Waniska as a human community. Right. So the pandemic has asked us to be awake and aware of our life, right, and how we do things and why we do things. And then in the midst of that, another wave was Black Lives Matter. Right. And so it's asked us to be aware about we've been asked to awaken and consider the quality of our relationships, and the devastation of racism and systemic racism. And then the third wave was the discovery of unmarked graves, and so those stories of those children that didn't come home were an active part of our stories. We knew those stories. But as Canada, as Canadian citizens, this was the proof that was needed for people to be awake to Waniska. And so with all of this knowledge, we have responsibility. And so we, as a leadership team at First Nations University of Canada and at NOSA, or whatever group that I'm a part of, I see that work as purposeful work, and it's also active work, to where we have this responsibility to do what we can to leave this place, our world in a better place for those children not yet born 7 generations into the future. So again, I'm not sure if I answered the question, but
well, so it sounds like despite some of the challenges and the difficult times that we're going through right now, you're optimistic.
I am
about the future.
Mm-hmm. I see that as leaders, because I see everyone as having leadership responsibilities. We all have a circle of influence. And I also see that a responsibility of a leader is to impart hope. And how do we impart hope in our organizations, in our families, in our communities, like our children, because of what they're seeing on social media and the news, are very concerned about their future. And so with that, how do we inspire creativity, the creativity and the fortitude that they will need to solve these problems, these global problems,
Yeah.
and to have the hope that they will accomplish that.
Wow. Well, and yeah, I mean, that I think that the struggle right now for all of us, and whether it's post-pandemic or just the way the world is changing, has been difficult. So to hear that there are leaders who are thinking positively and pushing forward, it's really, really critical. And I really appreciate hearing that. We'd love to hear some more questions. Oh, here comes something. What would you say to the leadership in mainstream universities about how best to approach the processes of telling the truth and reconciling for the future? What advice do you have?
So what we know is that in the past, there was very little quality content and in some cases, content that wasn't correct in our elementary and high school curriculum about Indigenous peoples. I'll say about Indigenous peoples, because much of this content did not come from Indigenous scholars or authors. And so there was, years up until recently, anyone who graduated from high school had very little knowledge and understanding of Indigenous peoples. And so one of the questions that I get often is, how do we work alongside, right? How do we partner? How do we collaborate in respectful ways? And so for our senior leaders now, where's their knowledge level of Indigenous peoples? Have they ever had to work alongside Indigenous peoples, been led by Indigenous peoples? Have they considered their own implicit bias and explored the systemic racism within their institution, considered how to combat anti-Indigenous racism, and how to be inclusive of Indigenous peoples at decision-making tables. And so there's a lot of learning for our senior leaders, and it's good to see, or our non-Indigenous senior leaders. And so and I'm encouraged whenever I hear a senior executive taking on this learning and asking these hard questions and making these hard changes and significant changes, and talking openly about not only systemic racism, but the value of Indigenous peoples in our knowledges. Of course, centering, those stories, those lived experiences, and the intellect, the amazing intellect, sophisticated and complex intellect that Indigenous peoples have, and is important for today's world again.
Here's a question that came in through email. As your institution expands and the desire for learning in Indigenous contexts increases, are you able to bring in enough Indigenous faculty and/or instructors to meet the demand for your instruction in these contexts? Are you having any challenges with this?
We currently aren't. The majority of our Indigenous faculty and staff complement, or the story, I'll rephrase that, the majority of our staff and faculty complement are Indigenous. But as we grow, that will, I can't really foresee. I know that there are many Indigenous students, growing number of Indigenous students within our PhD program. So when space is made and when Indigenous peoples are welcomed into these spaces, and when these spaces are intentionally changed to create these a sense of belonging, then you will have this you will get more Indigenous faculty into these spaces, and staff and students. And so Indigenous peoples will lean into those spaces that really don't have as many barriers for success.
What about other post-secondaries in Canada? Does anybody offer programs, PhD level programs in Indigenous practice, education, science, cultural perspectives? Are there programs being offered?
Yes, there are across the country, and increasingly they're being led by Indigenous scholars and leaders, and so that is happening. Whether it's at University of Victoria, I know has programming, and University of Manitoba, and so yeah, it is. There are amazing programs that are being led by Indigenous scholars.
So that's growing too outside of FNU, which is a good sign. A lot of post-secondaries now in Canada also have put in place vice provosts of Indigenous
Right.
or people of that capacity. So I think that in that question about whether or not there's a recognition at the post-secondary level, having these new positions in place is driving that opening of the knowledge and the understanding that we're looking at the situation and need to think about it at the post-secondary level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it is an incredible time for Indigenous peoples, and I'm just really encouraged by the leadership of our Indigenous youth. We still have these I'll say these extreme experiences. So many of our Indigenous people still live in poverty, and then we have those that are moving through that and accomplishing success within learning institutions. And if you look at the United Nations 17 Goals for Sustainable Development, and picture Indigenous peoples in each one of those, are we able to achieve those goals by 2030? That will be a challenge for Canada, because Indigenous peoples do fit into every one of those 17 goals, and how how we can support support parity, how we can support health and wellness in our communities is important, because by doing that, we're strengthening Canada, right?
And it does feel as though Canada is doing more than some other nations to to move forward. And I mean, I think that's a positive sign. I want to pull this up. I want to say hello to Vanessa, who's coming to us from the Midwestern United States. She asked about whether there'll be a transcript. There'll be a recording, and we'll make sure to share it with everybody who's been here. It'll be posted on our website. We'll tweet it out as well. So just so you know, there will be a recording. But then she asked another question. She's looking about a master's degree in Indigenous studies. They're few and far between in the U.S. Here's your chance to do a pitch. What advice would you have for her? FNU.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, consider First Nations University of Canada. We do have a graduate program, and so as I mentioned earlier, we're strengthening not only our continuing education program, which is new, but also our graduate programming and our whole academic arm. You know, there are definitely more. There's actually a few Indigenous studies programs across the country, but maybe we can. So
Vanessa, check it out.
Mhm. Yeah.
We're just about out of time. If anybody has a last question, I think we can probably squeeze it in. I'm going to ask one while we wait to see if anybody comes in. You and I talked about this a little bit before we came into the program today. It feels different this National Indigenous History Month that we're just coming to the end of. It feels different to me, and I don't know whether it's just the way the media is portraying it or whether there has been some sort of a shift. But the events that I've seen, particularly on National Indigenous Peoples Day, they seem to be more collaborative. There seem to be more celebratory. And I don't know whether, as I say, whether that's just the media telling us everything's hunky-dory or whether we are. I'm certainly feeling more positive. And I don't know whether that was, whether that was something that I took from the media or whether it really is a feeling that something good is happening. And I wonder how you feel about that.
As I mentioned earlier about the Cree phrase "Waniska," and I am hopeful, and I do witness and see some of these changes that are happening at the heart level, I'll say. There's this phrase that Cotter and Cohen, and they have this book, The Heart of Change. And basically the theme of the book is we see, we feel, we change. And so learning is important. And, and that's the seeing part. We can get moved by what we read. But once we connect that learning to our emotive selves, then we're looking at potentially amazing shifts in our beings, and we see, we feel, we change. And so it's a process of transformation, again, at the individual level and at the collective level. And so there's these amazing, I'll say, pockets in Canada where they are leaning into the celebration of Indigenous peoples in amazing ways, and also recognizing and acknowledging the challenges that we've had to endure due to federal and provincial policies and legislations, right, that really led to trauma. But with that comes amazing demonstrations of resiliency. So I also sense that, and for me, that awakening, I believe, happened last year, with the truth, the voices of those children that passed in schools and were buried on school grounds. And so that reality set in. And with that, many people, I believe, just opened themselves up to that particular truth. And with that comes more of these meaningful and engaging activities that we saw and experienced on June 21st.
Moving forward in a good way.
Moving forward in a good way. And that's
really important.
That phrase, in a good way, is
absolutely. We have one last question that's just come in. Very engaging, inspiring presentation. Amazing to hear about the exciting programs with FNU and the support for Indigenous communities. With online and hybrid learning growing due to COVID-19, we learned a lot from that. Is FNU looking to do some online studies in the future? And if so, what have you found to be key supports for Indigenous students? I would think because of that ability to work in remote programming, this is a huge benefit. As the online world opened up more, I would think that to be able to access education has become a little bit easier. I mean, you still have to have an internet connection, right? But what's FNU doing and thinking about online education?
We have had forms of online teaching for years. And so when we all had to shift into virtual spaces, that was done very quickly by First Nations University. And so we will continue hybrid forms of programming, and there are some purely online programming, and of course we have the on-campus experiences and our the land and place-based learning that happens in the cultural learning that happens at our traditional campus. Of course, that was a bit of a challenge, but it did happen. So even that switched into an online platform.
I guess you had to get creative. I hadn't thought about that.
Our elders became very, very adept with technology. And they were open to it because they didn't want to stop teaching,
which is fantastic.
Exactly. Yeah. So we will continue all of that and reach as many people as possible.
Well, I see we're just past the top of the clock, so I kept you a couple minutes beyond when we were supposed to. I don't want to let this program get to close without getting a chance to say a very, very special thank you to you for all the time you've taken. It's been wonderful to speak with you today and really great to reconnect. I think that we've all learned a lot, and I'm just feeling very optimistic coming to the end of this program, and you've always been that kind of a positive person who sees the positive side of things, and so it's really uplifting to know what's happening at First Nations University, to hear all the things that are going on, and to really know that we are moving forward in a good way. It's so very important. So thank you again. Thanks to our audience. If you have any last comments to make, Jackie?
Well, thank you so much for this invitation and any opportunity that I have to talk about Indigenous knowledges and First Nations University, and of course collaboration and partnership with Indigenous peoples. I will make time and space for that, and just thank everyone for being here today. And I just encourage you all to continue the good work. Getchimigwitch.
We're just so honored that you could spend time with us. So thank you, everyone. If you want to know more about CCE Canada, you know where the website is. Magda may pop it up one more time if we have a chance. And we'll see you at the next program. Thanks so much. And again, we'll be emailing the link to the conversation, the video for this conversation. It'll be on our website, and we'll tweet it out as well. So thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.